to continue this discussion right now. Joining us now, CNN contributor Leah Wright Rigueur, CNN presidential historian Tim Naftali, our senior political analyst Ron Brownstein, and retired U.S. Army General Wesley Clark. He's the former NATO Supreme Allied Commander. Ron, let me start with you. How would you rate this approximately 15-minute speech by the president?
Yeah, I mean, look, it was a solid, strong presidential speech. I'm not sure it was will be as iconic as Reagan's speech, and it was most interesting in terms of our 2024 choice in the way that President Biden linked the struggle to preserve democracy around the world with the struggle to preserve democracy in the U.S. as we face something we have not really encountered before in American history, with the dominant faction in one of our parties not committed to the principles of constitutional democracy that we have, that have endured for over 2 centuries in this country. So that is the case he is making. I think it is part of the case he has to make in November. There is an audience for that. There's also another group of voters that he needs to reach that finds all that a little abstract and needs to know more about his plans to make their economic life better. But in terms of kind of putting a stake in the ground and linking the international with the domestic struggle, I thought it was effective.
Very eventful. Tim, you're our presidential historian. Big picture, how important historically, how significant potentially is this speech by the president?
Well, the very fact that it happened 40 years after another iconic moment at Pointe du Hoc allows us to see the differences between 1984 and 2024. In 1984, Ronald Reagan was trying to reassert the moral character of the American commitment to the world. That was a time when some in our country were arguing that there was a moral equivalence between the Soviet Union and the United States. And so Ronald Reagan used that iconic place and the fact that he was standing in front of 62 heroes who had scaled Pointe du Hoc 40 years earlier to make a point about the fact that when the United States came to Europe, Americans came as liberators, not as conquerors, thus contrasting the United States with what the Soviets had done in their empire. Ronald Reagan had a second objective in 1984. 1983 had been a very tense year in the Cold War. Indeed, it was known as the beginning of the Second Cold War. And in 1984, Ronald Reagan actually wanted to send a signal to the Soviets: we Americans don't want war. We fight them when we have to, but we don't want war. And then Ronald Reagan made a point in the speech at Pointe du Hoc to talk about the 20 million Soviets who had died in World War II. 40 years later, the President of the United States uses that same sacred ground to make a point about us and our character. This speech was a lot about character, the character of Americans at their best. He talked about the sole survivor of D-Day who was in front of him, and talked about the importance for that hero of his band of brothers, of those that he was fighting for his country, of course, but he was also fighting for those around him and for those whom he had lost. And the president made a very, very poignant point. We mustn't forget the fact that we are part of a community, that we should care about each other, that we should care about others more than ourselves, and that is being American. Now, he didn't mention Donald Trump's name. He didn't have to. But it gave a sense that he is in some way framing the choice, not between his character and Donald Trump's character, but between Donald Trump's character and the character of America at its best. And that character is personified, or was personified, by those 225 Rangers who scaled Pointe du Hoc 80 years ago. So that shows you two things. One, the difference in the campaigns 40 years apart, but also the difference in the challenge the country faces and the use by two presidents of a sacred moment in our history and of sacred ground to make the case to the American people about the importance of morality in our times.
Good point. General Clark, you're the former NATO Supreme Allied Commander. You're our military expert right now on this panel. This is certainly hallowed ground, as we all know. More than 70,000 Allied troops died during the invasion of Normandy 80 years ago. How did you view the president's speech, and did it strike the right tones amid this backdrop?
I think it was a very, very powerful and even a brilliant speech, Wolf. Powerful in the sense of the setting, the evocation of the Rangers. You know, I was in the Pentagon as a colonel. I listened to Ronald Reagan's speech in 1984 about the boys at Pontahawk, and I had around me a group of captains and majors, lieutenant colonels working for me for the Army Chief of Staff, and we had tears in our eyes when we heard Reagan talk about it. Biden's speech will evoke very powerful, very strong support from the men and women in uniform in the United States. It is an evocation of Ronald Reagan. It's an evocation of what America's military stands for. As far as the allies are concerned, I think they should be very reassured by this. You know, the policy in confronting Putin is it's evolving. We're getting a little more forward. We're pushing on Putin a little bit more. The White House in recent days has authorized the Ukrainians to use American weapons to strike back in Russian territory and to shoot down Russian aircraft over Russia that are threatening Ukraine. These are significant moves. Putin can hear it now in the rhetoric, and he can see the response. So I think we're moving to tighten the noose on Mr. Putin and his aggression in Ukraine, step by step, carefully bringing the allies together. So I think it was a really powerful speech, just the right time, just the right moment. And obviously, he's got the mantle of Ronald Reagan behind him. So I think it has some enormous domestic impact as well.
Good point. Leah, you're a presidential historian as well. You teach at the Johns Hopkins University. There was certainly a lot of focus on Ronald Reagan's speech on that very spot 40 years ago during the 40th anniversary of the D-Day invasion. Do you think this speech by President Biden lived up to that legacy?
I think it had to live up to the legacy, and it's not just about is this kind of broader legacy of Ronald Reagan, but it's also, I think, a soft launch for the second stage of Joe Biden's presidential campaign. We know that the first stage of the campaign was the battle for the soul of America, but one of the things that the Biden administration has realized is that that same argument is not hitting in the same way with American or global audiences. So I think what we're seeing here now is a twofold attack. One, this idea of democracy abroad and democracy at home. So connecting this idea of the international and the creeping idea, right, harkening back to this to ideas that Ronald Reagan talked about, but the idea of Russia, the power of Russia, the increasing aggression of Russia, but also harkening to ideas of China, right? So just defining these very, very different ideas of what are allied powers, what are Axis powers. So again, reassuring, I think, allied powers, but also it is doing the work, I think, of reminding people at home that there is a connected community of what democracy means. One of the things that we know is that democracy within the United States, also globally, but democracy within the United States is in crisis. As the rest of the panel has already mentioned, Donald Trump didn't need to be mentioned because he was evoked in the ideas that Joe Biden talked about. So this is an attempt, I think, not just to remind people about what does democracy mean, how democracy is something that has to be fought for, remade over and over again, but also to speak to ideas of democracy that were incredibly popular on both sides of the aisle. So he's bringing up this legacy of Ronald Reagan, and I think it's an important launching point for the next phase of the campaign.
And we heard the president once again say that the young men who stormed Pointe-du-Hoc and these other areas in Normandy and helped turn the tide of the war, the mission matters more than their lives. They all believed that, and that's why the U.S. and the Allies turned the tide of the war and eventually defeated Nazi Germany within a year after Normandy. We'll watch all of this together with all of you. To all of the panelists, thank you very, very much.